This morning we're going to see where, I could have been really creative and titled the lesson, When Abram Lost a Lot, but we won't go there. We live in the world where we are surrounded by more opportunities to gain wealth, to gain friends, and to be totally immersed in all kinds of entertainment. That's the kind of world we live in. We live in a world where all kinds of activities are presented to us to be involved in that can distract us from the more important things. And with all of that, we live in a world full of tension. As Christians, as those who want to follow God, we have the things of this world pulling at us, trying to pull us away, trying to get our attention, trying to get the feel, if you will, of trying to be part of a world that in many ways is totally alien to what God desires of us and for us. And so we have this tension every day. Living in this world, what is going to be my top priority in making choices? Today's lesson, we're going to be drawn to the time when Abram and Lot, they have returned from the Egypt experience. The Egypt experience was not where God called Abram, but it's where he wound up because he trusted in the Nile before he would trust in God to get him through the famine. But now they have left and they've come back. They've come back to Bethel. Lot and Abram got rich in Egypt. Abram already had a lot. But when he comes back, he has a lot more. And Lot evidently became very rich in their Egypt experience. And it came to the point to where they had so much when they got back from Egypt that it caused tension between those who took care of their flocks. And so we read in our text. Can you all read that? Yeah, okay. If you put your magnifying glasses on, you can read that. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. But the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great they were not able to stay together. And quarreling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's. The Canaanites and the Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. So Abram said to Lot, "Let us not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan toward Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord. Now notice this next line, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. It seems like what is happening here is that the blessings were a threat. They were a threat in the relationship between Lot and Abram. So Abram is the one that decided, we're going to have to decide what we're going to do. And I want you to notice something. He gave the right to choose where to leave and to live to Lot first. He gave this to Lot. So what motivated Abram's decision? What motivated him to say to Lot, you choose, you go this way, I go that way. You go that way, I'll go this way. What motivated him to do that? I want to share with you what I believe is going on here. And the first one is that Egypt taught him to look beyond himself. Let me back up here. Yeah. Egypt had taught Abram to look beyond himself, or beyond self. Now, where had he just returned from? In Egypt. What happened concerning his wealth while he was in Egypt? He had amassed great wealth while he was in Egypt. It also seems that someone else amassed great wealth in Egypt, and it was Lot. And so now Lot and Abram have to decide. And here's something I've noticed. The more stuff you have, the more time you have to spend managing your stuff. I don't know if I'm a philosopher or not, but that's something I've discovered in my own life. I remember when we just had a small yard in the front and back, and I could mow it in probably 5-10 minutes. Now we live on an acre, and it takes Sandra all day to get that done. You see, before their side trip to Egypt, they lived in harmony with one another. Lot and Abram were living in harmony with one another. But when they returned from Egypt, with all this new wealth and all these new possessions, the land could no longer contain all of their stuff. And sometimes I've learned over the years that when it comes to making decisions about material things, especially large amounts of material things, is when a person's true character emerges. I have sat with families planning funerals, and rather than being interested in the funeral, they were fighting over the stuff. And it would be people that would surprise me. I would have never thought that they would have that kind of character. And because of the great amount of stuff, both Abram and Lot had, the squabbling began. Which means a decision had to be made. I want you to know what I find interesting about this story. Abram was the leader of the tribe. And in that culture, Abram had the right to choose first. It was his right. But instead, he gives that right up. And he lets Abram choose first. He says, Lot, you choose first. Now, why does Lot have so much stuff? He has this stuff because he went with Abram to Egypt, and he acquired a lot of stuff. So everything he has, he really owes to Abram. And I believe Abram learned something in his Egyptian experience, and that is he learned the heartache and the headache and the damage that comes by living by the philosophy of me first. He learned the damage that can come by living by the philosophy, take care of number one. Folks, that's why he was in Egypt to begin with. He did not inquire of God. He didn't build an altar and worship God and inquire. He didn't pray to God and ask him, do you want me to go to Egypt? He just packed his bags and went, living for number one, and he learned a lesson. By doing that, it not only got him into trouble, it also endangered his wife, And now Abram has displayed the wisdom that the Egyptian experience taught him, and that is the kind of wisdom the world does not understand. If you're going to live for God, you don't live by the me first, number one philosophy. Egypt had taught him to look beyond himself, because whatever you chase for yourself will usually lead you away from God. And Abram had learned that lesson, and evidently he had determined he's never going to do that again. Secondly, Egypt had taught him to consider others above his own interest. One of the humiliating experiences in that he had in Egypt, if you remember, is he was corrected by an ungodly pagan. You remember Pharaoh jumped on him for what he did. Pharaoh corrected a man of God. A pagan corrected a man of God. It was humiliating. In verse 7, and quarreling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's. The Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. Folks, I don't think that's in the Bible just because God said, we need to add a sentence here so we'll fill this book up. Those people who lived in that land were also pagans. And evidently, Abram had learned, I am never going to make a decision again that will give an opportunity to a pagan to correct me. He had learned something in that land. What did he learn in that land? He learned that a lack of integrity and deceitful in Egypt would haunt him the rest of his life, and he was not going to do that again. And that memory maybe have hurt him so bad that he probably thought to himself, never again will I live before the ungodly and the pagan neighbors around me that will cause me to lose any opportunity to tell them about God. It seems as if he had come to the point in his life where harmony in the family was worth more than any material possessions. It looks like he believed harmony, character, and sacrifice were more important than stuff. Thirdly, Egypt had taught him to trust God. What led him to Egypt in the first place? Trusting in the Nile rather than trusting in God when the famine hit Canaan. You see, the world economic system teaches us to claim it before yourself before somebody takes it away. Isn't that how the world teaches us to live? You get it before somebody else does. However, what happened to Abram when he tried to live by that rule? I'm going to get to Egypt before anybody else does. He learned that it came with a great price. And that price was his integrity, his character, and the embarrassing opportunity to be called a hypocrite by the ungodly. That's what he had learned in Egypt. He learned that from the Egyptian rules of reasoning. And living by faith are two different things. The Egyptian experience taught Abram the importance of living by God's standards and God's promises rather than living by sight. God had promised Abram a land and a future in Canaan, not in Egypt. Those promises were in Canaan, not in Egypt. Egypt taught Abram that God does not need his gimmicks, his manipulation, or his reasoning to help God keep God's word. You see, that's what got him in Egypt. But once Abram became a pilgrim, he had learned to think differently now. He learned that because when he left Ur without a single promise of God except one, you follow me. And now he's learning to trust God. He's learning to trust God and not the rules and the economic of the world. But Lot was different. You know what's interesting? We don't read one time in Scripture where Lot built an altar or worshiped God. We don't read that anywhere. So my question is, what motivated Lot and his decisions? Abram had learned something in Egypt. Well, let me tell you, Lot learned something in Egypt too. And let's look. Lot learned in Egypt, it increased his lust for more. Abraham learned one thing, Lot learned something else. Look at verse 10. Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan toward Zoar was well watered like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. He liked what he saw in Egypt. He learned to trust the Nile. He learned he liked stuff. And he believed that it made more sense to depend upon the Nile than evidently in Canaan. The two men went to Egypt. They experienced the same thing, but they came about with two different priorities. Abram came back humbled, saying, "Never again will I lose my integrity before God. Never again will I live such a life that will embarrass God." And Lot came back saying, "I like the herds, I like the flocks, I like the rivers." While Egypt humbled Abram and increased his appetite to serve God, evidently it only served to increase Lot's appetite for more stuff. So not only that, secondly, he desired more of this world. Notice what we read in verses 12 and 13. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. Brethren, it was no secret what was going on in Sodom. It was no secret even to Lot what was going on in Sodom. Now, the Bible doesn't say that line by line, but it does say their reputation preceded them. So why would Lot want to move in that direction to raise his family there? Why would he want to expose his family to that? I heard one preacher explain it this way. He said, well, maybe Lot realized, well, they need somebody with godly standards to live among them to show them how to live godly standards. How well did that work out for him? We do read in 2 Peter 2:7, and if he rescued Lot, a righteous man who was distressed by the depraved conduct of the lawless, yeah, he was distressed by what he saw. But brethren, the call of God, listen carefully, the call of God is not to be distressed over sin, it is to be separated from it. He may not have approved of what was going on there, but neither did he have to move next to it. And he didn't have to stay there. But you see, to have more of this world and to have more stuff, sometimes you have to move next to the ungodly to receive it. I think, thirdly, his wealth called him to live by the present. Believe it or not, this is the first time in the Bible where great wealth is mentioned. You can write this down. In the 13th chapter of Genesis is the first place where great wealth is mentioned. Lot and Abraham. And I think it's interesting. The first time it's mentioned, we see the effects it had on two different people. One said, I will never be controlled by that again. And the other said, I want more of it. Abram's wealth was from God, but he chose to live by promise. Lot had wealth, but chose to live by the present. And notice, God did not affirm Lot's decision, but he did affirm Abram's. When did God do that? It says, the Lord had said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. You remember that promise? When did God affirm Abram's decision? Believe it or not, it was not until now. You know why? Did Abram fully, 100% do what God said in this verse? Did he take somebody with him that God said you're supposed to leave behind? Who was he supposed to leave? His family, his relatives. But now that he has done this, now he has separated himself from Lot. We read this in verses 14 and 15 of our text. The Lord said to Abram, now notice, after Lot parted from him. Look around from where you are to the north, the south, the east, and the west. All that land you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. Let me tell you something. What land did Abram see? He saw all of it, including the land that Lot had chosen. God said, it's now all yours. So what lessons can we learn from this? I think if we don't learn a lesson from this, we're just not really reading Scripture properly. There's something we need to learn from this story. There's something we need to take away. And I believe the first thing we need to learn is that a worldly-minded person will sacrifice long-term good for short-term gain. That's exactly what Lot did. Lot said, I will take all the stuff. You see, carnal people view material advancement as the most important thing to live for. And they will give up their future for the present. If I can have it now, I want it now. And if Lot was distressed by what was going on in Sodom, let me tell you, his family wasn't. Who did his daughters marry? Men from Sodom. And if you remember the story, when God told Abram to go rescue Lot and his family, what did he say? He said, when you're running away, don't look back. And what did Lot's wife do? She looked back, and the word was longed for. She did not want to leave. And if you read the story, which we will in a few weeks, we're also going to read that when Lot told his family that they need to get out of town, including his sons-in-law, he said, we need to get out of town. God's going to destroy this place. What happened? They thought he was joking. Folks, let me tell you something. If you live a life like Lot and you decide now to get serious about God, it's going to be a hard time to convince your family that you're really serious if you've never been serious before. And do you know what the last picture we see of Lot? The last picture we see of Lot, living in a cave, his daughter's getting him drunk so they can commit incest with him. And the sad part of the whole story is he could have had it all if he would have done what God said. But he traded long-term good for short-term gain. But then, that's not the whole story, though. How about a spiritual person? A spiritual-minded person will sever a present relationship for future reward. Abram had learned the reality of the promise. And the promise is there's more than just comfort for the present. You don't live for the present. You live in the present for the future. For some, there's no harder area to relinquish than carnal relationships. I won't tell you the whole story, but I'm going to tell you part of it. When I was preaching in Wichita Falls, I had a Bible study with a family and baptized basically the whole family. And one of the members of the family was a boy named Leslie. Leslie was he was a great guy, really looking for the Lord. He worked. He had a girlfriend. Leslie was about 24 years old and had a Bible study with him, baptized him. He came to my office one day. We continued our Bible study together. But then he confessed to me, he said, "Jack, I've learned something. I've learned that if I don't get married to my girlfriend, I'm going to have to move out or she's going to have to move out." And I said, "You're very wise." I said, "I will be more than happy to do the wedding for you, and I'll do it for free." So he went and talked to her, and she was not about to commit herself to him. So he had to move out. And he told me later that was one of the hardest decisions he ever had to make. He said, "Jack, I had to make a choice. Do I follow God? Or do I continue to live with a woman who is not my wife?" I've known family members who've had to turn their back on other family members because those family members were not in any way going to live any kind of a life to glorify God. They were totally self-centered. They were totally selfish, and they were living a lifestyle that was worse, as bad as what was going on in Sodom. And they made it clear they were not going to change. And I've known family members who have lost family members because of their lifestyle. They could not continue to empower them, and they could not continue to enable them to live a lifestyle of living in Canaan or living in Egypt. And they had to move. They had to leave. Jesus told us that this might be the price of following him. And he said certain people, when this happens, are going to lie about you, call you all kinds of names. They're going to call you, some of them are even going to crucify you. And Jesus said, when that happens, you do what? Rejoice, because great is your reward in heaven. You see, a choice has to be made. Am I going to follow Christ? Or am I going to settle for the comfort of Egypt? Brethren, it's not hard to marry. But let me tell you, it is harder to find the right person to marry. And my recommendation would be wait for the right person. It's not hard to go into business partnership with someone. But let me tell you, it's harder to find the right partner. And for a spiritual person, it's better to wait. It's not popular teaching. However, we must understand something. God calls us to leave sometimes relationships, sometimes things, and sometimes stuff behind because He knows what's best. And if we will relinquish those things for His sake, it's called living by promise. That's what Abram learned in Egypt. You see, the promise that God had given to Abram was not in Egypt, it was in Canaan. But something had to happen in Canaan for those promises to be kept. And that is, some things had to be relinquished. And one of them was Lot. Is it fun? No. And I have a feeling I'm talking to some folks right now that have been there. Maybe there's somebody now that's struggling with it. Let me tell you, it is not an easy decision. But you've got to look to the long term. Where is this decision going to lead? Where is it going to place me 5, 10, 15, 20, 100 years from now? And by the way, let me tell you something. Every one of us are going to be somewhere in 100 years from now. And I have a feeling none of us in here will be here in 100 years. But we're going to be somewhere. So are we living for then, or are we living for now? And the lesson of Abram is live for then. Yes, God has blessings for us in this life. The blessing of peace, the blessing of forgiveness of sin, the blessing of a spiritual family, the blessing of living a life to its fullest as Jesus promised in John 10. That blessing is for here and it is for now, but it can be given up so easily by looking to those who we might wish we could be like. And we give up who we are. And that's a high price to pay. A high price to pay for the here and now. All the promises of God do not mean that I am going to be rich and all my health issues are going to be resolved and all that's going to be fixed and my bank account's going to be full. God doesn't make those promises. What God does promise is peace. And you know that's what the world's looking for. I think that's what Lot was looking for. But look how his family turned out. Did he find peace? He found everything but it, peace. What did Lot do the rest of his life? I wonder if the rest of his life he had wished he would have done what God said. Anyone that blesses Abram, I will bless. And all Lot would have had to do is say, Abram, you choose first. You choose first. But he liked what he saw. And he wanted it. Are there any Lots here this morning? I've always wondered about this story, and I think a lot about this story when I have to make decisions. And this story has kept me from making some bad decisions. Not all the time. I wished I could say all the time. But one thing it has taught me over everything else, Jack, there's a future out there. And one day you're going to be in it. It's kind of like the time when I was in Turkey, when I was in the Air Force. I couldn't wait to get back to Texas. You know, where there's dust, and especially West Texas. That's where my wife was living at the time with her family. Nothing but dust and rocks, and there was a tree there, but I think somebody finally cut it down. I didn't want to come back to Texas because of what all the beauty in West Texas. I wanted to come back to Texas because who was there. And so while I was in Turkey, every day I got up and made a decision. I'm staying out of trouble today. I'm making all the right decisions today, and I'm working as hard as I can today to not mess up my being able to go home. Because if I'd have messed up, I could have wound up in jail and never come home and given up my future for the joy of the second. I said last week, I'll say again. God gives us the awesome ability to make choices. And He lets us make our choices. What He does not do is give us the choice of the consequence of those choices. God bless you. Love you. I hope and pray we learn something from having a lot. Thank you.